Oh, hey, you ended.
Hey,
Oh, we're live. Yeah, recording started. Hey, how are you?
calling Chris Anderson in London.
Believe it or not, I am in London for
Are you really, though? Are you really?
well, no, not really.
Okay.
But calling Rick Byron, not really Chicago.
Chicago, but not really
Not really.
Chicago.
We're really, yeah.
Because
Surprise,
really,
surprise.
yeah, really, we are in France, right?
What
In
France?
France, and we are starting today the masterclass Normandy Breakout Tour.
Mm.
So we're here through the magic of videotape. And welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours. Where, Chris?
All around the
All around the
blue
world.
marble, Europe, Pacific, America, the
Check it
West.
out at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or watching or listening
or
on the podcast.
on the podcast.
Thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about the effort to remember World War II veterans at the U.S. Cemetery in Margraten in the Netherlands. Please let us know you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. Due to the extraordinary circumstances of today's show, I have a lovely glass filled with, could be gin, could be vodka, could be water.
Be water,
Yeah.
yes. As Rick, as you pointed out, having two shows back to back with cocktails could be
Could be
somewhat
dangerous.
problematic. Yeah.
We want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon. You know who you are, and here are our top shelf
I like
patrons.
it. Look at
I know it's a growing list. You can help us keep the history taps open and running by becoming a patron at patreon.com/history happy
that. Be
hour.
hour. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think we have enough people and we have filled enough
Stuff.
stuff. We've done enough stuff
Stuff.
that we can probably get going. So if you give
All right.
me a cue, I'll get us started.
The water cooler is open.
The bar is open. 3 years ago, Chris, we welcomed Dutch historian and our friend Sebastiaan Vonk to HHH to talk about a project of remembrance undertaken at the American Netherlands Cemetery in Margraten. And now that project has led to a remarkable book, Faces of Margraten, just published in English. Sebastian and his co authors are joining us today to talk about this book and their efforts to make sure that individual GIs who fought in World War II are not forgotten. So we want to welcome today Sebastiaan Vonk on the lower right, Jori Videc on the upper right, and Ari-Jan van Hees in the lower left. Gentlemen, thank you so much
Welcome.
for coming today.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. They're quiet. We hope to get them talking
Yeah,
by the time we get
we'll get a
started.
talk. Yeah.
So listen, you guys, I'll start with you, Sebastian, and then maybe you can hand off to the other people as needed. But how did this a project that you're involved in that has ultimately led to this book, Faces of Margraten, which is, I might just add, is a huge book. Okay, I mean you can see it's bigger than me. And
Mm.
how did it get started? What happened that led to this?
Well, it started as a project at the cemetery itself. I think many people that travel with Stephen Ambrose, they are on tours that go to the Margraten Cemetery. And it started very simply with the idea, asking ourselves, who is the person that is buried underneath all these crosses and Stars of David? So what we try to do is, literally put a face with the name on the headstone to show the person was buried there, and that I guess it's easy to be overwhelmed by the mass. You get on those stairs and look at all those crosses, but then you sort of realize that there are individuals buried there. But that's just a picture, and the picture still doesn't tell the full story. So for the 75th anniversary of World War II, which is about 3 years now, we came up with the idea to do a book, to go beyond the picture, and tell the full story. And that's sort of how Jori and I met, because Jori was working on stories. There was this very general idea for doing a book, and those two ideas came together. And led to the book with the help of Ari-Jan. Well, it had already published 2 books to this very big Faces of Margraten book that we like to call Monument in Print.
So I think, for those folks who haven't traveled to Margraten, could you tell us a little bit about the cemetery? What is it? Kind of how it came about, and explain that a bit to folks, because I think we take for granted that we all know what an ABMC cemetery is, but they might not. So a little bit of background might be helpful. And why don't you guys dive right in?
Well, somebody other than Sebastian knows, because we've let Sebastian talk, and so we're going to get the other people talking.
Ari, why don't you try?
I can show you. Wait a minute. Tomorrow morning, I have a guided tour with American tourists, and I have a map, which I always show to the people. I hope it's visible on the internet. Yeah. This is a picture of Margraten in 1946. The first burial took place in November 1944, shortly after the liberation of this area. And initially, about 19,600 soldiers were buried at this cemetery. And the idea was that it would be a temporary cemetery, but it became a definite one in 1953. Of the 19,600, 61% were exhumed and returned for burial in the United States. So at this moment, at our cemetery, we commemorate 8,301 soldiers, men and women, because there's also 4 women buried there. And there are 1,722 names on the walls of the missing. So in total, we commemorate 10,023 individuals whose names are also mentioned in the index of our book. And we tell 250 stories of some of these individuals.
So as you mentioned in the book, you're telling about one story out of 40 for the people who are in the cemetery or whose names are mentioned in the cemetery. And obviously part of that is going to be because you don't have necessarily the stories of all 10,000 people. So I guess I would say, how many people do you have stories for? And Jori, this one's going to be for you. How did you decide, who decided, and what kind of fighting took place to say who's going to be remembered in this particular book?
Okay, well, for the English edition, we had, I think, approximately 275, 280 stories written together. And of course, through Microsoft Teams, we had a lot of conversations together. And yeah, we have to decide with the 3 of us which 250 stories will be included in the book. So it was a hard decision sometimes. But I think the most important criteria for the selection were the documentation of the stories, how special were the stories. Do we have been in contact with next of kin in the United States? And how did we obtain the information from archival records in the United States, or just from websites or other books? So that were the main points of discussion during the selection process, in my remembrance.
Right. So could you guys tell us a little bit, though? I mean, because one of the genesis of this whole thing is the whole Faces of Margraten project, and Sebastian touched on that a little bit already, but maybe you could explain a little bit more about what that program is, because it's sort of unique to Margraten. So explain kind of how that starts and how that led to
Right. So yeah, that was really an idea that came up for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. As a foundation, we have been collecting information, stories, photos ever since 2008, when we set up this online memorial that we like to call Fields of Honor database. So we had been collecting stories and information and photos for so many years, and essentially been putting a face to soldiers online. And I think the idea for the 70th anniversary was to do it on the place where it matters most. And I think that's the cemetery. That's where you're emotionally touched, where you read the names, where the people are actually buried. So that was the idea for the 70th anniversary. Let's make a special tribute to the men and women who have liberated the Netherlands and the rest of Europe, by sort of, giving back their personality in a sense, because they're more than just a name on a headstone. And I think we try to have visitors emotionally engage with those people, to make sure that they would stay connected, that it would resonate with them more. I think one of the most powerful responses to that is that we had someone that was around my age at the time say, I finally realized that, these guys were of my age and I could have been one of them. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from the project, that at least for visitors, it's not a very abstract mass that was fighting the war. They were all individuals that fought and died and who left behind loved ones.
And this project is generated from Dutch civilians, right? This isn't an ABMC project. This isn't a government. This is the Dutch doing this. Right.
Yeah, it's all volunteers. It's really a group of 25, 30 people here in the Netherlands and in Belgium, but also in the United States, who spend, I'm just sometimes amazed how many hours they spend on trying to find like one single picture. Especially at this time in the project, we have found over 85% of all faces. So we're really getting into the very tough cases. Where there might not be family left, or very distant family, or you can just tell from the amount of pictures that are coming in. We had times that we had at least 100 each month, and now we're happy if we get like 10 or 15. It's just become so much harder to find new faces.
But I guess that's one of the points I wanted to kind of bring up, and we'll provide links and whatnot to everybody by the end of this. But this is an ongoing project, right? This book doesn't mark the end of the project. You're still pursuing other names and other stories. And okay, yeah.
So listen, before we dive into any specific stories, and we have a few we want to talk about. Let's talk a little bit more broadly about why it's important to you to remember World War II. And you guys are not all exactly the same age, and your stories, I'm sure, are different. And we'll start with Ari, and then we'll do Jori, and then we'll do Sebastian. So why is it important for you to remember World War II? Why does this have so much meaning for you?
One of the main reasons is the story of my father. When my father was a young man, in September 1944, we had this big operation, Margraten, which had the intention to liberate the whole of the Netherlands. And just prior to Margraten, his tiny village was surrounded by German soldiers. And at gunpoint range, he was ordered to pack a suitcase. He was taken to the Rhineland, to the city of Bochum, where the German Krupp Großer Stahlverein, they had their big factories manufacturing artillery guns for the German army. So my father was a slave laborer. And if he hadn't been liberated on the 14th of April 1945 by the 79th Lorraine Division, the United States Army, he would have worked himself to death as a slave laborer, and I wouldn't have been born. It's as simple as that. That is the greater part of my motivation. And of course, I've been in the Dutch military. I've been in the Dutch National Guard for 16 years. That influences you as well. I did 53 parachute jumps in military style. So that all makes that you are so interested in this topic.
Jori, you're next.
Thank you. Well, my job is I'm a history teacher in Maastricht. It's a Dutch city, about 10 minutes by car from Margraten, from the cemetery. And I think when I was 10, 11 years old, I watched the movie The Longest Day about D-Day, of course, and I was so touched by it. And at that age, I couldn't completely understand why soldiers storm a beach under enemy fire to be killed or to be wounded. Of course, now when I'm older and I've studied a lot about World War II, I do understand to free us, to give us back our liberty here in Europe. And also my family history, it's very important to me because my grandfather, living also here in the Netherlands in 1944, he was liberated. His hometown was liberated on his 29th birthday. And afterwards, he always told to his only son, to my father, that that was the best birthday present he ever got in his life. And he never got the chance to say that in person to me because he died when I was, I think, 4 or 5 years old. So I was a small kid. But my father told it me repeatedly that he had said that when my father was growing up. And I think by saying that, well, he realized completely how important freedom was because he lived through 4 years of occupation. He was of German birth, so he lived in the Netherlands under German occupation. So that must be a very strange period for him. I want to do something back for the liberators who came home, but also, of course, for the liberators who gave everything for us, who sacrificed their lives. So with my classes, I visit the cemetery every year. I guide my students there. I made a small scavenger hunt so they can search for stories themselves, and that's my way to um, yeah to create the future ambassadors of freedom. That's my main goal, also with the book. So to do something back for their sacrifices.
And Sebastian?
Yeah, unlike Jori and Ari-Jan, I don't really have a family history, although my grandmother's brother fought during the early days of the war and was later sent to Germany to work and actually returned suffering from tuberculosis and died a few months after the end of the war. But that was, for me, initially not really something that was a factor in my interest. It was really sort of that fascination with, learning about soldiers, the stories. You start with a name and of a grave that you adopt, and then delve into the story, try to find a picture, try to find family. That was like early on the fascination I had, influenced by Lawrence Shea, a corporal from Brooklyn, New York. It was his grave that I adopted in 2006. But later on, so when you're 17 in the Netherlands, you get this letter from the Department of Defense saying, hey, you're turning 17. We don't have an active draft at the moment, but you are registered for the draft. So in case anything happens, the government can decide to activate.
We know where to find you. In case anything happens, we know where to find you.
Yeah, right. So essentially, yeah. And that for me was sort of like that moment of realization, like, oh, it could also be me, if something happens. And I think I started to reflect more, particularly on, Lawrence's story. He was 21 years old when he was killed. Now, I've always been trying to figure out, okay, what would it mean to me? And I don't think it's in any way possible to really understand what it means to be drafted, to be sent overseas, to actually fight in a war. Of course, even less so to be killed in a war. But that for me has always been an influence, like the main takeaway from all these stories, like saying, it could be you. And I think Ukraine has sort of really impacted a lot of people's thinkings. Again, it could be us. I mean, war is not that distant. And there could be a next lost generation, which I think definitely is the case in those two countries, both Ukraine and Russia. And I think we like to take it for granted that, we can enjoy our freedoms and barbecue on Memorial Day or whatever. But it's not that to be taken for granted.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I want to get to the book, but I also just kind of wrap things up with the faces. What's been the reaction to this effort? Because again, it is unique, and has that changed over time? I mean, kind of what sort of feedback are you getting from the Faces program?
I think the greatest thing to see is that sort of other cemeteries have implemented the program since, including a few American cemeteries. So we've seen it in Cambridge, where a lot of soldiers are buried that died in the lead up to D-Day, training for D-Day, or aircraft personnel. We have seen it at Suresnes American Cemetery, which is a World War One cemetery next to Paris. So it's true, and also in the Netherlands, one of the big Canadian cemeteries is doing a Faces event actually in a few weeks. Groesbeek, another Market Garden cemetery. But that's again what I was talking about. It's really being able to emotionally connect to a person. It's not that you're looking at a headstone. It's really an emotional attachment that you will develop with that particular soldier. We really invite people to meet the soldiers. And it's interesting to see because people are usually just walking on the paths, and when the faces are out there, everyone sort of scatters around, walks among the graves, takes time to look at the different pictures. I've seen families, explaining to their children what they're seeing on the pictures. And again, it's really those kind of responses like, I now understand, or I realized this could have been my son. And I think that's a very powerful, and of course, all the graves in Margraten also have been adopted. So for many people, it's also sometimes like the first time they actually see a picture of their soldier, to put it that way.
And we should get this one question that just occurs to me. You just mentioned graves being adopted, and maybe somebody else can answer this, but what does that mean? What is it? I don't know, Jori or Ari-Jan, if either of you guys have adopted a grave, but what does it mean to adopt a grave, and what do you then have to do, and how long will you hold on to that? How does that work?
Well, speaking as one of the older generations, I always make the joke, Jori and Sebastiaan, they have the same age as our son. We have a son of 26. When Jeroen, our son, was 11 years old, Jeroen said, "Dad, I want to adopt a grave." We as a family, we had already adopted the grave. So he realizes that his freedom was paid with the highest price, the life of a soldier. Now, he was randomly given a name, because you can't pick a name on the wall of the missing, Robert Watts from New Hampshire. And I have here a picture. And some of you may have seen this picture in books. It's an official US Army signals photograph, and it was taken on the 18th of September 1944 in Holland during Operation Market Garden. And the soldier wearing the helmet and the American flag around his arm is Robert Watts. Now then it comes very close. Your adopted soldier has a face. And our son realizes that this young man remains forever 24 for our freedom. And that is the whole essence of the adoption phenomenon, that you realize a young man, a young woman with talents, average age 24, who wanted to make something of their life after the war. Their life was cut short for our liberation, for our freedom. And that's the essence of adopting. And we will pass this on to him, and he will pass it on to the newer generations, and it will continue.
But what does he or you, in the case of your adoption, what do you have to do? When you say I've adopted this person, what does that entail?
Well, adopting means that you realize that at least you have to go to the cemetery 2 or 3 times a year to honor his sacrifice. It can be on his birthday, the day of his death, our commemoration of the Dead Day on the 4th of May, our Liberation Day on the 5th of May, your Memorial Day, which we have here on the last Sunday in May. You have a day off on a Monday. Mm-hmm. But that's when adopters gather, bring their flowers to the graves or to the walls of the missing to honor the sacrifice of a young man or a young woman.
Okay. So you talked to us a little bit about one soldier, and maybe I can go to Sebastiaan and Jori and ask a little bit the same thing. And Sebastiaan, maybe you can start by talking to us a little bit about a soldier named David Teal from New York City, who was one of the people that you, when I said, who's somebody you want to talk about? And you said, well, David Teal is somebody.
Right. Yeah. So as a background, I think there's a lot of soldiers that were struggling to get even like small pieces of information or a picture even. David Teal, on the other hand, I think was sort of lucky that his father was an author. So his father is Pulitzer Prize winner Edwin Teal, a naturalist, who has published a lot of books, including a series of books that he wrote after his son's death. So one way for Edwin to cope with David's death was to travel together with his wife. And he wrote a series of 4 books named after all the 4 seasons, based on the travels that they made to sort of, deal with their son's death, to sort of give it a place. One of those books won him a Pulitzer Prize. The great thing is, so the archives of Edwin Teal have been preserved at the University of Connecticut. So there's a lot of information, diaries, letters, you name it, and it exists, including this flag. This is a Nazi flag that their son David had sent home a few days before he went missing. And what his parents did, is reach out to the soldiers that were on this flag, because like I said, David went on a patrol near the city of Koblenz, had to cross a river. They crossed back, and David, so they were attacked, and David sort of fell overboard, was last seen hanging on to the craft they were in, but he had to let go and drowned. But it took until somewhere in 1946 until he was found. So you can just imagine, and that's what you see when you are reading the diary of Edwin. His parents were, trying in every way possible to learn more about their son and what had happened to him. Like I said, one of the things that I did is reach out to those names on the Nazi flag, hoping that someone could tell what had happened to their son. And that's, for me, it's like a treasure that you open with so many sources being available that you can almost document someone's life fully. There's a lot of information on, his early life, on David's early life, till the very end. His letters home have been preserved. So I found that a very special story to be working on, and in a sense, the home of David and of Edwin and his wife. They moved from New York to Connecticut after their son's death, to a place that is called Trailwood. It's a big area that has been preserved, so there's a lot of trails that you can walk, but also their home has been sort of preserved in the very way they left it when first Edwin and then his wife died. So if you go in there, in the study room, you will still find a picture of David on the wall, and it's now used as a retreat for artists, for authors, etc.
That's I can see why that'd be somebody that you would pick, that would sort of stand out for you with that kind of trail there. Chris,
Jori? Hold on. So we're going to have
go
Jori.
around. So yeah. Jori, you could tell us about Edward Brodowski, a staff sergeant in the 80th Battalion.
Yeah. I choose this story because I was able to get in touch with his son Bruce, and he was born only weeks after the death of his father, and that has of course a big impact on him. You can see his son here in the middle, and on this picture he is standing on the exact intersection in Germany near the city of Gelsenkirchen, where his father was killed in action on Good Friday 1945. So on March the 30th, sorry. He was a tank commander in a Sherman tank on that day. You can see him on this picture. He is in the upper left, manning the machine gun mounted on the top of his tank. This picture was taken here in the Netherlands while his tank was evacuating wounded infantrymen in open ground. He was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for his bravery in this action. And several weeks later, months later, he was killed in Germany on March 30, 1945, when he was driving through the northern suburb of Gelsenkirchen. Suddenly, the right track of his Sherman tank was shot off by the main gun of a German Tiger tank. So it was disabled. He couldn't drive the tank. And of course, they were in shooting range of the Tiger tank. So he ordered his crew to leave the tank, but he himself and his loader of the crew, they decided to battle it out with the German Tiger tank, well knowing that the main gun of the Tiger tank was much powerful than the gun of a Sherman tank, and the front armor of the Tiger tank was almost not too was not impossible to get through it with shells. But after firing 3 of his shells, he slipped down himself behind the main gun of his Sherman. He fired 3 shells, and then the turret of his tank was hit again by a shell from the Tiger tank. And Edward and his loader were killed instantly by that hit. And he was 25 years old. He remained forever 25. And weeks later, his son Bruce was born. And in 2015, his son traveled to the Netherlands and to Germany, to the place where his father was killed. And his travel ended in Margraten for the first time in his life, visiting the grave of his father. And that was a very emotional experience for him, of course. He's kneeling here in front of the grave. Very special picture. And I was able to reach out to him by email, asking him more questions about what his father did in the war and about how he was killed in action. And he shared his information with me. And then I started writing a story. I sent it to him, and he checked it. And I think he was emotionally affected, of course. And it was special to me to be in contact with his son. And I found some similarities with his story, the story of Bruce and Edward, and my own grandfather's story, because my grandfather, the same grandfather I told about a few minutes ago, he was also born 4 months after the death of his own father. So my great grandfather was killed in World War I, fighting in the Austro-Hungarian army, and 4 months later, my grandfather was born. So that is almost the same as the story of Ed and Bruce Brodowski. So that hit me very much.
And then Ari-Jan, we'll ask you to tell us about Verl Miller.
Yeah, Verl Miller, that's a special story. We have adopted his grave more than 20 years ago. And we are in touch with the family. And the strange or the important thing is the family in the United States becomes kind of your family. But the sad story behind Verl Miller is he was 19 years old. His elder brother was drafted. And their father had recently died. And his elder brother had recently married. And he was responsible for the family farm. Now, apparently, there was the possibility to swap places. So Verl said, you have to stay on the farm. I will take your place. I will go into the army. And he became a member of the 82nd Airborne Division, a mortar soldier. And he was a replacement. And he was sent, his first action was Operation Market Garden in September 1944. And the sad thing is his war just lasted 1 day. He landed by glider on the 23rd of September near Grave Bridge. His unit advanced to Groesbeek, where they had to take up a mortar position on an important crossroads near Plasmolen. And he was the first casualty of his unit, killed by a German sniper. And his war lasted just one day. Now his nieces Sue and Cindy visited us in the Netherlands last year. Due to COVID, it wasn't possible to come earlier, but Verl was posthumously awarded the Orange Lanyard by the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and I will explain about this. The 82nd Airborne was awarded the Cross of William, comparable to your Medal of Honor. but each individual soldier of the 82nd received an orange lanyard. Veul's family never received this award. So we took care that the Dutch Ministry of Defense provided this orange lanyard. And on this photograph, you see Colonel Sadler, the American military attaché, in presence of the chargé d'affaires on the left, presenting the orange lanyard to Cindy, who is on the right, and Sue, who is on the left, the two nieces of Veul Miller. So you can imagine how emotional such a process is, but how important for the family that the adopters remain involved.
Yeah. So, guys, it's a monumental task to collect these stories. And I know every case is different and individual, but can you give us some kind of a sense of how you go about doing this? I mean, you know, you've got a name, and how do you then dive into this? How do you decide where to go and what steps to take, and what's that look like for you? And I don't know do I
You
pick
know what?
one?
Yeah, but this is now you're all
All right.
warmed up. One
Well,
of you is
there
just going
we
to have
go.
to answer.
It is important to mention that, of course, it's teamwork. Just to
Right.
give you an example, this is a class book, the United States Army Air Force class book. We have a team within our foundation, and we index all these class books. We get them from friends in the United States, and with a team of 4, we index 200 names which are in the class book like this. And then we compare all these names to the burial registers at abmc.gov.
Yeah.
And on average, we find 5 photographs within a class book of 200. Sometimes just one photograph for Margraten, but sometimes another one for Cambridge, which we send on to our friends of the Faces of Cambridge. So that's just one example of how we find, in this case, the United States Army Air Force photographs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really. I don't think there's like one way to go about, trying to reconstruct a story. Sometimes you're lucky and there's information available online. Some people have put out like after action reports or unit histories that will at least help you, give a sense of what happened to the particular unit a soldier was serving in. But it's kind of rare. And sometimes there are newspaper articles. Sometimes people have, published stories on the internet. But there's a lot of ways to go about it. We have been going to the archives in the United States, so both St. Louis and College Park in Maryland. One of the biggest issues with researching American World War II service members is the 1973 fire in the archives of St. Louis. So a lot of the, military records, at least the individual military records of soldiers, of about 80% have been lost. And if you have them, you can sort of trace every step of a soldier in the army from the moment that he enlisted to the moment that he died, even to the extent that you can see when they paid $1 for their laundry. I mean, it's that detailed. So it's very helpful to have these kinds of records. But again, only 20% survived that fire. So that makes it difficult. So there's a lot of other ways. So we have volunteers sending letters in the United States to possible families, or making calls to possible relatives, or contacting high schools who might have, a yearbook with a picture in it, or a memorial display. American Legion, VFW posts, libraries, newspapers, and I guess at some point you also have to be lucky, to just be able to find something. I can remember this story of someone was reading in the newspaper about, us looking for a picture, and she was like, my uncle was killed. I wonder if he's buried in Margraten. And she posted a question somewhere online that I happened to see, and that's how we were able to connect and get that picture. But it was like a lot of chances, and at any stage it could have gone wrong. And now it's one of the stories in the book. It's Joseph DiFazio. Family, his brother was still alive at the time, had never seen the grave, had never been there. And actually the grave adopter and the family became good friends, visited each other both in the Netherlands and in the United States, all because of people trying to find one picture to go with that name.
So Jori, I just want to finish. So Jori, I want to bring you in on this. When Sebastian and Ari say we, how many we's are there? Like, how many of you guys are actually doing this work?
I guess over 30 people, maybe 40. I think
Okay.
Sebastian knows the exact amount of people involved, but of course we did the writing with the three of us, but without the efforts of dozens of others. Some of them I have never met in person, so they were living in the United States or in Belgium, but they're doing everything to add as much new faces and new information to our online database. And mostly the database of the fields of honor is the starting point of new research. And of course, that's a very valuable source to us. When we don't have this source, I think the research will be a lot more difficult, and it is difficult already. So I think it must be dozens of people. I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
So what's the website that you're talking about? Fields of Honor.
The Fields of Honor database.
Oh, so it's a not a website; it's a database.
Yeah, you can find it on Google.
Okay.
It's
Um,
yeah.
I'm looking it up.
I don't know the exact spelling.
Oh, okay. It's we can we'll let Chris work on that. And meantime, let me just remind everybody that we're talking to the authors of the book Faces of Margraten, which is the story of some of the soldiers who were buried at the Margraten ABMC cemetery in the Netherlands. And I want to ask about this person on the cover, because I'm sure that if you have 270 soldiers in the book, that there was some discussion as to who is going to end up on the cover and why. So who is that soldier, and why is he on the cover of this book?
So this is Staff Sergeant Maurice Gosney, and I think actually we didn't have a lot of discussion about whether or not to put his photo on the cover. I think actually I remember getting that photo, seeing it come in our mailbox, and I was like, we have to do something with this picture. And then the book came up, so I think it was like a no-brainer that he would be on the cover. And the most special thing I think about this story is not so much what happened during his life, even though there's a lot to say about it. But last September, his sister, Lucretia, visited his grave in Margraten. It had been a lifetime dream of her to come over, and sort of it became a trip against all odds because, COVID happened. And then just before the trip, like 3 weeks before, her husband passed away. She was suffering from dementia, but she's really wanted to make that trip. We just saw Kristin, her daughter, on screen, who sort of, she submitted the photo after visiting the cemetery a few years before. And Kristin said, like, I don't think that if it was not for the book, that this trip would ever happen. It cost so much within the family. Maurice was not really talked about, and going, in the process of making the book, in writing the story, they started to talk to each other. They actually went looking for more information, and it sort of revitalized that dream that Lucretia always had to go to her brother. And then in September of last year, it finally happened. They made it happen, even though, again, she's suffering from dementia. Her husband had just passed. But there she was, walking like a fit young girl, all the way to her brother's grave. And the first words that she said was like, "Oh, Squid is here." So Squid was the nickname that Maurice had for his favorite sister. And I think, these stories, we sometimes tend to forget we're working on stories. It's just more than history. And I think these moments sort of, and the same with, the Orange Lanyard presentation, sort of it always hits me and makes me again sort of remind me that it's more than history that we're working on. This is something that still matters to people and still emotionally impacts them, and it's something very real to many people.
So what? I guess this I'm going to put to Ari, because Ari, you've written books, and this is I mean, aside from the information, it's just a visually stunning piece of work. I mean, this is, you just pick this up and you know that it's an important thing, right? What was the process? I mean, you could have just put this out as a little paperback and, you know, it would have been fine. But there's obviously a lot more going on here. Could you talk about why you decided to do it the way you did it, with the pictures and just the size of it and the presentation of it?
Well, when we first started the Faces of Margraten, I wrote in our local little village newspaper each week a story about someone who is buried at the Margraten cemetery. And when we had the idea of presenting this book, we thought, well, everyone should be represented. White, black, Christian, Jewish, soldier, non-commissioned officer. So that's when you go and find the stories, and you want to have an equilibrium with regard to the stories, and you don't want to repeat the story over and over again. So that was indeed a difficult process in finding eventually 250 stories. Of course, the book is not like a novel which you read from front to end in one go, but the intention is that you pick up the book, read a few pages, and again realize that this young man or young woman gave his or her life for someone else's freedom in a country far away.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, I'm looking at Ari-Jan's huge bookcase behind him, and the same goes for you, Chris. You know, it's so easy, and I know, Chris, everywhere you go, you pick up 10 books, put them in your luggage. But, you know, I think one of the main things behind our vision was to make something that wouldn't be like any other book, that would not end up in that bookcase on the shelf. It was really, again, it was made for the 75th anniversary of you know, the liberation of the Netherlands. So it was for a special event. I think it carved special stories. And it's a special way for us as Dutch people to say thank you, you know, to the soldiers for what they've done, for their loved ones. So we wanted something that would stand out. For us, it's really a monument in print. It's more than just your average book. And for us, it's really a book that's deserving of a place on a coffee table or a prominent place in a classroom, as a very, well, I'm not sure if it's subtle considering the size, but we wanted to be like a sort of daily reminder, you know, that you would see, you know, to those people to we own so much, quite literally.
Well, you succeeded in spades. I mean, it's a stunning book. So I promise it won't just go in amongst all my other books, Sebastian.
No, and I'm sure we're looking at your bookshelves, Chris. I'm not sure that your shelves are big enough to hold that book in there. That's my issue. It ended up on the floor because I couldn't fit it onto a bookshelf here in the office. Hey, let's do a couple more individual stories. And Jori, I'll start with you, and you can pick a soldier there to tell us about.
Well, a very special story is the story about William Albert, because I was able to be in contact with his grandson. And William Albert, he was from Massachusetts, an ordinary soldier. He was drafted in March 1944, and after a brief basic training, he was sent to Europe and attached to the 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Old Hickory Infantry Division. And this division liberated big parts of the province of Limburg, is the southernmost province of the Netherlands, and also where Margraten is located. And during his 11 months of service in the army, he wrote a total of 225 letters back home to his wife. She's called Doris, and his 3-year-old daughter, Donna, the mother of the grandson of William I was able to be in contact with. His name is Mark. And the last letter William wrote was the day before he was killed in Germany. And the header of the letter is somewhere in Germany, because he was not allowed to say the exact location of his unit at the time, or he simply don't know where he was in that huge country he never visited before. And it was 4 pages long, and the last page of the letter starts with a very sad phrase. He was trying to comfort his wife by telling, well, darling, please try not to worry about getting a telegram. But we know now, a few days later, she did receive a telegram, this telegram, telling her that her husband and the father of her daughter was killed in Germany. And the day after writing this letter, while he was advancing through an open field in Germany, about 1 hour by car from where I live, I visited the field where he was killed. He was shot by a German sniper's nest concealed in a haystack. So it was impossible for him to see the danger before he was shot. And I was told by his grandson that the Germans manning the sniper's nest were shooting with a machine gun. So he had absolutely no chance at all to survive this encounter with the German soldiers. He fell to the ground, and he was 27 years old. And he remained forever 27. And 5 years later, when his daughter Donna was 9 years old, William's widow remarried with another man. And her new husband insisted that she threw away all of William's letters and all his other personal things sent home by the army staff after his burial in Margraten. And she said she did. And then for 3 decades, there wasn't talked about William in the house. So his daughter Donna, while growing up, she knew nothing about her father. The only thing she knew was he was a soldier in World War II and was killed in Germany and is buried overseas. That was the only thing she knew for about 30 years. But then in 1980, when her mother was dying of cancer, she revealed a well-guarded secret to her, and she told her, well, I haven't thrown away all his letters 30 years ago because I couldn't forget your father. I have hidden them in a small shoebox under a wooden floorboard of the attic of the home. So find them, bring them to me, to my bed, and then we will read through them all. So Donna retrieved the letters, and then she read them together. And her mother said, well, I will tell you everything about your father now. So more than 3 decades after his passing, through his letters, Donna was able to know who her father was, thanks to the preserved letters. And that story was told to me by her son, Mark, the grandson of William, and it really touched me. And last week I was emailing with him again, and he's willing to come over to the Netherlands again, and I hope to meet him in person soon. So that will be a very special moment.
Yeah.
And Ari, do you have another story?
Well, tagging along with what Jori just said about things happening so many years after someone was killed, there's a story in our book, in fact, about the first American casualty to be buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery, Charles Summers from Pasadena, California. Charles was sent to England as a liaison officer to gain experience on British radars which could pick up German submarines. And those German submarines were hunting supply ships sailing from the American eastern seaboard to the United Kingdom and being torpedoed. The Germans called it a happy time. Now, while flying with an RAF squadron, Charles Summers was shot down. Now, 80 years after his death, a month ago, we found pictures in the British archives, the National Archives in London, of that same raid of the 4th of May, 1942. And we have found pictures of 5 airmen, 4 British Royal Air Force men and 1 American, standing on the wing of a Lockheed Hudson in the middle of the North Sea. Regrettably, they all perished due to hypothermia. But even after 80 years, you find a picture of that rate of those aircraft and those 5 men. The 4 British are buried in Amsterdam. Charles Summers is what we now know the first casualty who fell on Dutch territory, including the territorial waters, buried at Margraten, killed on the 4th of May 1942. So strange things, interesting things are still raising to the surface for us, well, historians.
And Sebastian, we'll do one last individual story. And you got a couple to choose from there.
Yeah. So one of the stories I also found interesting, because I've also been in touch with his grandson, is that of Willie F. Williams. I think one of the tragedies, when it comes to Margraten and the war, is that Europe is liberated by May 8, 1945, but after that, soldiers still died, whether it be in car accidents or Willie served with an ordnance company. He was killed in June in an ammunition explosion. So there's this sense, I survived the war, and then still his wife and their 2 daughters were left behind because, he was killed. And I think the other thing about this story is, at the time of World War II, the army was still racially segregated. So the cemetery, in fact, there were 2 companies of black soldiers, about 400 in total, that were, sent to do the horrendous work of digging graves day in, day out. But the cemetery itself is a place where everyone is commemorated equally. There's no distinction when it comes to rank, to race, to age, to your unit, to the day you died, because there is this vision like everyone in death is equal, while they were not in life. I mean, Willie Williams also served in a segregated company. There's a lot of stories in our book of soldiers who served in all black units like tank battalions, or maybe the most famous example is Willie F. James Jr., one of the 7 African-American Medal of Honor recipients, which was sort of a setting history right. It was only awarded in the 90s after President Clinton ordered a study into why did no African-American soldier get a Medal of Honor. But it's, the sad thing, there is this goal of fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy. But then a lot of soldiers actually were, confined to separate units, often to supporting tasks, like Willie Williams. And his grandson, Dave McGee, was always very outspoken about this. He always said, like, there is this stereotype, or there was this stereotype during the war about, black soldiers not being able to fight, not being able to learn. And then he would send me his grandfather's notes that were all put together in a suitcase that his wife kept but never showed to anyone. And when she passed, he inherited that suitcase and then learned everything about his grandfather. But he has always been saying, like, he was a soldier like anybody else, and as good as a soldier as anybody else. But that's sad story that again, a country fighting for the democracy and liberty of others, and doing it with a segregated army, with soldiers like Willie Williams.
So, Chris, you want to finish this up here?
Yeah, I just, I can't tell you guys how much I was impressed by this book, and it really is a magnificent thing, and it's something that I know that I'm going to use on my trips, and I think everybody should read it and experience it. And I think experience is probably a good way to describe it. But what you are doing is really important. But what can people do that watch the show? What can they do to help with what you're doing? Obviously, buying the book is a help, but what other things can they do to help your project and help your efforts? Because as you said, this isn't over. You're still working on it.
You got 1,500 still to go. Right. So what
yeah,
can people
and
do?
That's just Margraten. I mean, our foundation is working on 6 cemeteries in total, over 40,000 soldiers in total. For us, it's always a help if people just look around in their own community. Are the soldiers from your own hometown or county that are buried overseas and might be still be looking for records? We have people actually adopting their whole home state, trying to, find more information, because most of us are in Europe. A lot of it is available online, but there's so much, been digitized. So anything that people can do in their own communities, ask around, look around, be our boots on the ground, so to speak, to help us find those missing pieces of information and photos, so that we can, continue to add to all those memorial pages in our Fields of Honor database.
Yeah, and I checked. I tried to get a banner up on the screen, but of course I blew that one. But Rick, maybe you could help. It's just www.fieldsofhonorfoundation, all one word, .com.
Oh, this is where the show slows down.
Yeah, sorry.
Fieldsofhonorfoundation.com.
Yep.
Okay, well, that would be this one. Did I get it right?
Yeah, there's almost.
So we're going back to edit that, because we're going to get this right here, and we can always a little editing in the show.
And folks in the States, while Rick is doing spell check, they can get this through Amazon or direct from the foundation, or how do they get your book?
It's available everywhere. So
it's available.
It's everywhere.
Everywhere that books are sold.
Really good. No, I haven't seen it at Foil, so I didn't know. So I'm just happy.
But it's available there, whether you've seen it or not, I imagine. We want to thank today Sebastiaan Vonk, Ari-Jan van Hees, and Jori Videc. I'm looking at the names. They're so small I can't see them. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your great new book, which is called The Faces of Margraten, available where books are available. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, guys, for this and for all you guys are doing. Really appreciate it.
Cheers. Okay.
Thank you.
And Chris, we are of course on the road.
Yes.
And next week we are going to share some of our on the road experience.
Are we?
Yes, we are.
Wow. Okay.
Good news.
I'm gonna pack an extra clean shirt then.
Yeah. So we have Normandy Breakout Masterclass with all of our historians, and we don't know exactly what this is going to be, but darn it, it's going to be something. So
it's going to be outstanding.
It's going to be outstanding. It's going to be a chance to see what we're doing in the field, and you're going to have an appreciation of what's going on when we're out there in the field. And we want to just say that aside from that, all we have to say is please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.